Velkommen alle sammen. It has been a very long time that I said I was going to do this video. One of the most important aspects to our old spirituality, the Fylgja. Now, I've said before how people are too focused on the gods and mythology in the Norse religion. The gods in the Viking Age would have been things that would be called upon and invoked on pretty rare occasions, whether it be during war, during annual sacrifices, or rituals to bring some sort of benefit to the larger society. They would be quite rare, you know. Making a sacrifice to Odin once a week to help you find your car keys, that is just not something that would have been done. But there are other spiritual entities in the Norse beliefs that we actually do have a lot more regular contact with. The Fylgja is the one that is actually closest to us. Its name literally means the follower. It's basically a spirit that is a part of you and even an extension of your soul that follows you everywhere you go, protecting you, watching over you, and can be an omen of many important things. Some have noted the parallel to the Native American spirit animal, but it's not quite the same, and as usual, there is just a whole bunch of absolute garbage about this online. So in this video, we're going over the actual sources to this big part of our spirituality. So before we start with the sources, a couple very important notes on the Fylgja. The Fylgja, or Fylgjur, plural, it doesn't appear very often in the mythological texts, okay, the Poetic and Prose Edda. In the Old Norse texts, the Fylgja appears mostly in the sagas. However, the number two important thing about the Fylgja, some scholars have brought to attention that the Fylgja and the Hamingja are almost synonymous and have an almost identical function and even form, depending on the source, usually as an animal or female spiritual figure. And the Hamingja, there definitely is mentions of it in the mythological text, the Poetic and Prose Edda. See my video I did on the Hamingja and all those sources, and you can decide for yourself whether the Fylgja and the Hamingja are one and the same. The word Fylgja, however, has a much more diverse connotation than the Hamingja does. It's because the Fylgja is found in a much wider range of texts and a much wider range of time periods. As a noun, the Fylgja can even be like just a general spirit or a ghost. It can also refer to the placenta, the afterbirth, among other things that the Fylgja can all go into over, let's say, 1,000 years of sources, we can say. But number three, and final intro points before the sources, we can break down the Fylgja into two sets of two categories, okay? We have the animal Fylgja versus the human Fylgja. The animal Fylgja in the sources is an animal spirit that resembles the person's soul, and then there's the human Fylgja, or at least you know, the spirit that takes the form of a human, and it's always a woman, a feminine figure, and it closely resembles more like a Valkyrie or a guardian goddess or female ancestral spirit, even, with the function of looking out for the person to whom it belongs. Here are a few names referring to the human Fylgja that you see here. The second categorization is between the animal and the human Fylgja. There is the Fylgja coming from the Old Norse sources detailing pagan times and pagan belief, versus the Fylgja in the later on folk tradition sources, some of them coming from as little as 100 or 200 years ago. They're very different, and sometimes they're even Christian in nature, but still they are very, very valuable sources because they go into a lot more detail about the actual beliefs. So those are definitely not to be ignored, even though those sources come from long after official pagan times. So we'll start on to the Norse sources first. So the Fylgja are not clearly mentioned in many mythological texts at all. Some examples, though, we can be very sure that it is referring to the Fylgja, so I thought I'd include a couple of those to start. In the Prose Edda, Snorri says that every person was born with a Norn who followed him or her throughout their life. They spun our fate, and then the fate of the individual depends on whether your personal Norn is a divine goddess-like Norn, whether it is elf-like, or whether it is dwarf-like. So that's very highly likely that Snorri is referring to the Fylgja in the Prose Edda. One clear example, I think this might be the only example of the Fylgja and the Poetic Edda. Actually, it comes in Helga Kvida Hjörvarssonar, one of the 9 Valkyries that ride to Helgi while he was sitting out on a burial mound doing utiseta. One of those was mentioned to be a Fylgja, and her name was Svava. And it was her that actually gave Helgi his name, and she told him how to find a powerful sword, and she also protected him in battles to come. A later part in that same poem, a witch-like woman that's attested as a Fylgja appears riding a wolf, basically warning of the coming death of Helgi. Another one in the Poetic Edda of Vafthrudnismal. I'll include, this one, Fylgja is not mentioned, but the Hamingja is mentioned here, so I'm putting this in just to give a little background of where the Fylgja might come from. It says there are Hamingja in the world of humans, but they were fostered among the realm of the giants, as told there. That's all I'll say about Hamingja, but again, check out that video. That's a long one with a ton of good sources. So that's it for the mythological texts, and next on to the sagas. Most of them are believed to be at least based on real historical events, although some, the accuracy is a lot, the reliability is a lot higher than others. But my favorite one comes in the saga of the Jomsvikings. The Jomsvikings were invading Norway with the sons of Eric Bloodaxe, who were leading them. And our beloved Norwegian chieftain, Jarl Håkon, he was leading the defense in the Battle of Hjörungavåg. Now, a female spirit here, who was named Thorgerd Holgabruder, is mentioned in quite a few other sources too, and she's mentioned as like an ancestral goddess-like figure. And she was especially responsible for watching over the various chieftains of Lade and Hålogaland. But in this saga, Thorgerd functions as kind of like a Valkyrie-type Fylgja. And she seems to be the Fylgja of Håkon during his life. She was worshipped, and Håkon called upon her for help in this battle of Hjörungavåg. And she agreed to help Håkon if Håkon sacrificed his son, which he did. And in result, during the battle, in the stormy weather, the Jomsvikings were said to have seen Thorgerd and her sister Irpa, who both appeared as like Valkyrie goddesses on Håkon's ship, defending him and shooting arrows out of each of their fingers. The battle was won gloriously, of course. So here, Thorgerd functions as like a Valkyrie and seems to be specifically the Fylgja of Håkon at the time. But again, in other sagas, she is the Fylgja of various chieftains of Lada and Hålogaland area, spanning over many generations. Although the word Fylgja is not mentioned in a lot of those sources, but yeah, I haven't read the original Old Norse version of those sagas, but yeah, of course, she is the Fylgja. And this is part of the problem that makes these sources difficult, because the translations and also these pagan spiritual terms like Fylgja, they're deliberately left out of a lot of these sagas, so we have to make assumptions sometimes based on the figures they are and their function. That is just what we have to do with some sources. But one source that the Fylgja is clearly mentioned in is in Njáls Saga and also Þiðranda, þáttr. It both says there that human beings have groups of 9 Fyljur, which is a commonly recurring number in the Norse beliefs. Also, in Þiðranda þáttr, there were two competing bands of Fylgjur that were fighting for the life of Þiðrandi, who played a role in Iceland's conversion to Christianity. 9 women in black were tearing Þiðrandi to pieces before the 9 women in white could arrive to defend him. And from these omens, the spiritual leader, Þórhalls, predicts that the conversion to Christianity will happen. This source also mentions that if you lose all 9 of your Fylgjur, it leads to deadly illness. So those 2 sources there, they mention that people have 9 female-like Fylgjur, whose job it was to protect you during life. But that is not mentioned in other sources, that people have 9 of them. But there are plenty of other mentions of 9 maidens in Norse mythology, so there could be a connection to all that there. Another source, Hallfreðarsaga, a human, Fylgjukona, she calls, is coming to Hallfreðr, and she declares that their relationship has come to an end, basically, like she's done being his Fylgja, and she wishes ill on him. And she later transfers her guardianship to Hallfreðr the Younger, in a kind of deal that made all parties happy. So your Fylgja could actually leave you and watch over someone else, it seems, usually in the same family, and that is a trait that we see of the Hamingja too, if you watch that video. Another source, Þorsteins saga, due to a family feud, Þorstein and his brother Þorr flee from their enemies, and they hide on a lake island. The rival family is hunting them down, and during the night before they were caught up to, Þorstein has a dream about the Fylgjur of the rival family hunting them down as a big pack of bears and wolves that came to rip him and his brothers apart, and they were led by 2 foxes, and this dream was an omen of the next day when they were going to be discovered on the island and attacked. Some more cool info. In the morning, the 2 brothers had a conversation interpreting his dream, and they show some real insight as to what kinds of men were believed to have certain types of animal Fylgja. The 2 foxes were said to be the 2 Fylgjur of the wizards, the 2 wizards that were hunting them down. The wizards and sorcerers that were leading them, and other sly people in general in the sources, are often depicted as having a fox Fylgja. That's not surprising. Bears that he saw in his dream were the Fylgja of the brothers that were hunting Þorstein and Þorr. And bears were typically the Fylgja of high-born men who also like a bit of ruckus, who also are a bit violent. But the wolves, they say specifically about the wolves. Who were the wolves? I don't know any man who has the Fylgja of a wolf. These must be new followers of the brothers, and they must be wicked men hated by all. So I know a lot of you want to have a wolf as your Fylgja. Oh, wolf is my spirit animal. I'm a badass. I'm a tough guy. But this was not regarded as a good thing in the Viking Age. If your Fylgja was a wolf, you're probably an asshole who nobody likes. Bears can sometimes be okay, but usually the most honorable men with a good balance between strength, honor, and good reputation, their Fylgja animals tend to be a bull, usually. Another part in this same saga, we see the Fylgja being lent to a friend for a certain period of time, and that is also something that can be done with the Hamingja. We can lend our Fylgja or our Hamingja out to someone else, either to protect them or give them good luck. Another one in Våpenfirðinga saga, Helgi here is about to go on a journey to the assembly, like the Althing. And his mother, who is said to have a gift of foresight, has a dream, and she wakes up crying the next morning because she has this dream where a bright, noble bull was getting gored by another violent red bull. The bright, glowing bull was the Fylgja of her son, Helgi, and it was an omen that he would be killed on his journey by the owner of the red bull Fylgja. So very often a bull theme with men, and that would be their Fylgja. It's not all about men, though. Women have fylgjur too, of course. In Gunnlaugs saga, birds in general are actually referred to as fylgjur, and in the sources we have mentioning it, birds tend to be the fylgja of women more often than not. I think maybe even every time that I'm aware of. And in this saga, a swan specifically is mentioned to be the fylgja of a beautiful woman in this story. Another one in Hrólfs saga. Here, King Hrólf is said to have the fylgja of a lion, actually. Very interesting, because lions are also referred to in other sources by a kenning called konungsfylgja, like the fylgja of kings. So how in the hell does someone in Scandinavia know what a lion was at the time, and how does a Scandinavian king have a lion as his fylgja? We don't know exactly, but kings many times had foreign animals as their fylgja, while commoners and the sources had native animals to Scandinavia as their fylgja. Also in this saga, there is a queen named Ingigerd, and she has a dream that shows like an omen of King Hrólf's lion fylgja going to Sweden and try to marry the princess, and he was being followed by his men's fylgja, which were 6 wolves, and a polar bear, which were interpreted to be the fylgja animals of the king's most loyal men that accompanied him. And in a second dream in that same source, the queen saw the same thing. A polar bear and 6 wolves were following him, but also a savage boar destroying everything in its path. So she guessed that the fylgja of this boar must be the king's brother, who was kind of like a reckless man. So even back then, among the spiritual leaders, fylgja animals and who they belonged to, it was not always clear. It was up to interpretation a lot of the time, and like I said, they came up in dreams. In another source, in Ljósvetninga saga, Eyjolfr dreams that a red bull and a gray bull were leading a herd of cattle against him. So he realizes that the owners of these fylgjur would be fighting against him very soon. In the same saga, a man named Einar dreams about a bull acting weird, and he was acting in a way that reminded him of Gudmund, his brother. When the bull dies in his dream, he knows his brother is going to meet the same fate. And this is often something that happens. It's an omen of death. In Kormáks saga, Kormák kills a walrus, which is described as having the eyes of a witch named Turveig. Turveig died shortly after that. Again, an omen of death. And to see one's own fylgja was also a strong omen of death. It was unlucky, and if you saw your own fylgja, in a dream, you were usually safe. But if you saw your own fylgja like in a vision while you were totally awake and conscious, you were in trouble. In Njáls Saga, when Þórð and his friend Njál were sitting, hanging out on the farmstead, Þórð sees that a goat is over in the town dying in its own blood. Njál says, Þórð, what are you looking at? He says, oh, there's a goat over there dying. It's choking in its own blood. And then Njál says, oh, nope, there's no goat over there. That must be your own fylgja that you saw. You better watch out, because death is near. To which Þórð replies, well, shit, if that's my fate, there's no point in watching out for it. It's coming anyway. Another example later in the story is when a man named Gunnar dreams that he sees a wolf fylgjur that he fights off, but his friend eventually gets his heart ripped out by the wolves, and this was an omen of an attack and resulting in his friend's death that was about to come in the next few days. So that's kind of all of those are the most known attestations of the fylgja from the sagas accounting for pagan times, but there are lots more. We can be here all day if we go over all those attestations of what we think the fylgja might be in the saga. So I'll move on for now, but you get the general idea and the main points. They're similar in most of the sagas. But I'll refer you to this free article here online. It's a great work that kind of tallies up all the Fylgja attestations in the sources and gives us the data, how often the animal versus human Fylgja shows up, even the type of animal Fylgja, whether it's a bull, wolf, whale, and so on, and how often we find them, as opposed to the human female type Fylgja. What functions the Fylgja have, and so much more, so much great info. It's only in Norwegian, unfortunately, but I will cover this article in detail in a Patreon video if you are interested. But for now, on to the next sources. We covered the ones, the sagas speaking about pagan times, but now we're going to go over the sources about the folk tradition. These come from folk tales starting in about the 1400s all the way up until the 1800s. Like I mentioned at the start of the video, a lot of these folk tales show little to no understanding about the pagan conception of the Fylgja. Sometimes they just call them like ghosts or spirits, or they seem to have lost the full understanding of what the Fylgja was in pagan times, but they're still very valuable because they go into a lot more depth about the beliefs and even some practices that we can actually use. Okay, so, and of course, these are not Christian inventions in these folk tales, okay? Even although they come from official Christian times, this wasn't something invented by Christianity, so we can, be pretty sure that most of these beliefs and stories go back to pagan time. First, we have Jon Árnason's collection of folk tales, and he has a whole section in his book dedicated to Fylgjur. And he specifically notes the similarity of those spirits to the ones of earlier belief. He says this is a book from like the 17 and 1800s, tales collected from that time, but of course from a lot older it could be originated. He includes the names of various spirits and labels them all as Fylgja that you see here. Of course, these are not all going to be correct, but he's on the right path. And this book, by the way, is my number 1 or 2 maybe favorite book on any Germanic folklore, so I recommend anyone who wants to read more pick that one up. Another one comes from a source in the late 1600s, and it basically accounts of ghosts in Iceland, written by, much earlier by the way, it was Gisli Vigfusson. The original source we don't have, so this could have been much older, but at least the preserved source comes from the year 1680. But Vigfusson apparently described troll-like figures who, after death, attach themselves to a family or individual. This is also very much like the pagan belief in the Hamingja and the Fylgja. And there is other evidence that real human females, specifically when they die, they take on this role of like a spiritual guardian, and they watch over the family as a Fylgja or a dis. And plenty of sources suggesting that. Another one comes in Sels-Móri. This source right here, it's a tale of a man named Thorgeirdr who was about to be sentenced to death in Iceland. Another man steps in and saves his life, but this man's wife gets pissed off and insults them, so Thorgeirdr then vows that he will be the Fylgja of this family for 9 generations, and he actually haunts them, but he only haunts the women due to the wife's unkindness. But the men in the following generations actually get positive things from Thorgeirdr, who was acting as a Fylgja spirit. So that's a bit of a weird source. It's one of the only ones that, it might be the only one that lists a male as a Fylgja. And also how it haunts, like a negative thing. Very different than the positive mentions of a Fylgja spirit. But there are some similarities to there, like, being passed down from generation to generation. Also, that's the only source I know of in the folk tradition where an actual human becomes a Fylgja, because in almost all the other ones, it's an animal Fylgja manifesting as like an extension of the human's soul. We rarely see a human Fylgja in the folk tradition. So all of these tales here also are from Iceland, and and mention animal fylgjas, but one specifically depicts the situation very well. This source right here: a group of travelers stops for a rest during the night. They all fall asleep besides one man, and the one man sees a blue light escaping from one of the tents, and he follows the light through the woods for a long time and throughout the night, and then he returns. And when the men wake up in the morning, the one who the light came out of tell us, "Oh, gee, I had a really strange dream last night. I went on a journey and found a big chest of gold." And the man who was awake and followed this light, he was like, "Oh yeah, that was your fylgja. I followed it. We should go back. Let's go." And then they follow it, and then they find the gold during the morning. So those were all some Icelandic sources and folk tales. Let's speak about a couple cool, very Scandinavian ones. How back home in Scandinavia, the fylgja was a bit different in the folk tradition than it was in Iceland from the same time. It was called the fylgja in Scandinavia, but more often it was called a vardøgr, which we don't really have a good translation for. One of the most common traits, though, of the vardøgr was to show up before the actual person. And in the Norwegian tales especially, the vardøgr was supposed to take the shape or even make sounds of the person who it belonged to, and it would show up about 15 minutes to half an hour before the actual person. So if you see a little glimpse or a sound from someone you know and they're not there, take the time, because they could be visiting and they're probably not far behind their fylgja when that arrived. The vardøgr was also an animal in the Scandinavian tradition. One way that you could figure out what kind of animal it was by wrapping a knife with a handkerchief and passing it around your body in a circle, saying, "My vardøgr is a horse," or "My vardøgr is a bull," and so on, passing it around your body with all the other animals. When the handkerchief falls off and exposes the blade of the knife, the animal that you just announced, that is your vardøgr. Another one to find out: when you are born, the parents in the folk tradition would take the placenta of the child, leave it out somewhere on the property, almost like a mini blot, actually, almost like a little mini offering. And the first animal that would come and take it, that would be the child's fylgja. A couple more examples of, what kind of people would have different vardøgr animals. If you were a person and you went into a farm and you had livestock that were scared of you, it was said to be that your vardøgr was a wolf or just a mean dog. If you were a sly, sneaky person, your vardøgr would be a fox. If you were a coward, your vardøgr was going to be a rabbit. If you were a greedy fat ass, your vardøgr was a pig. If you were a horny man who chased all the girls and didn't care about anything else, your vardøgr was a rooster, a cock. So those are just a few things listed in this source here. This is another great book about the Scandinavian folk tradition. Moving on to some more beliefs. If your vardøgr was supposed to protect its person from danger or sickness, just like the fylgja did in pagan times. So it was a danger that you would be separated from your vardøgr. So one tradition was to leave the door open for a bit whenever you entered or exited a building. The belief was so that your vardøgr would not be left behind, leaving you without protection. Also, like the fylgja in pagan times, if you saw your own fylgja, if you saw your own vardøgr in a vision, it would mean that you were about to die. If you saw it in a dream, it was okay, you could do this. Or if another person saw your vardøgr, it was okay. But if you yourself saw it while you were awake and conscious, and your vardøgr came out, you could see it, you were in trouble. You see what I mean? The folk tradition sources, although not as reliable about pagan belief, it's still very valuable because they go into a lot more detail than some of the oldest sources we have about pagan times. At the end of the day, there are still way more similarities than differences, so that makes us even sure that these things were actually believed in for at least 1,000 years. And those things that we can, assume they were believed in for this long are the things that they have in common. The fylgja was there to follow you. protect you from injury or sickness. The Fylgja can be a wide variety of animals. Sometimes it's a human, a female figure, usually, but again, it could be a male figure too in at least one source. Potentially a real human woman who lived, and when she dies, she takes on the function of like a guardian angel Fylgja, usually someone who is in her own family or descendants of her. The Fylgja can be inherited through generation to generation, but always, but can also be loaned away. Like you could lend out your Fylgja temporarily to someone else. The Fylgja can be interpreted as part of the soul, especially the animal type Fylgja. And finally, it can show up as an omen of death. So those things we can be pretty sure were believed in during pagan times, all the way up to the folk tradition. Potentially a whole lot longer. How far back does this belief go? We don't know, but that's about all we know for sure. There's lots more we can interpret, and even more we can learn by going through actual spiritual experiences ourselves, but that's not a subject for here on YouTube. But that's all. Hope you enjoyed the sources and the academic style education, but that's all for today. Vi ses nästa.